Hey everyone, Eggman here with another video, and today we're going to be talking about the red Shanks leader. It is one that we get out of the OP09 set, and I really think that he's a pretty interesting leader when it comes to deck construction and gameplay. He's pretty simple on the surface with his effect, but I do think there's some deeper layers for it, and there's also kind of a way to adjust to playing against it as well. So if you guys are new to the channel, please make sure to hit that like and subscribe. I really do appreciate it, and let's just jump on into it. So first off, what does the leader do? Just once per turn, you can activate this effect when your opponent attacks. Give it to one of your opponent's leaders or characters minus 1,000 power for the turn. So if your opponent's only attacking once for the turn, you're technically like a 6k leader. Sometimes it just prevents your opponent from being able to attack you for a turn if they're playing cards on curve, which is really nice. And it's just pretty simple, right? This is probably like one of the more defensive red leaders that we've gotten in this game. Generically, it's been more aggressive or just kind of more tempo for, which Shanks still is kind of like a tempo deck in a lot of ways, but just the ability to, prevent an attack or get like a free, 1k every turn is really, really strong, and it kind of adds up throughout the game too. So because of that, it is kind of a 6k leader, right? And we've seen this before for red with Newgate as well as Monkey D. Luffy. Usually there's some kind of like negative effect to go with it, with, Newgate taking a card from your life every turn, and then also Luffy only being at 3 life, but the fact that we are able to, again, once per turn, just be kind of a 6k leader is just really, really strong in its own way. You're not obviously a 6k leader on offense, but just the ability to do this does help Shanks just be a little bit more survivable. And there's just some kind of ways where your opponent, again, has to adjust into it, which we can talk about in a minute. But there's also this Red Hawk synergy. This has been a pretty common combo. This works a little bit better when your opponent's not expecting it, but Gum Gum Red Hawk says your leader or one of your characters gets plus 4k power during this battle. Then KO one of your opponent's characters with a power of 4k or less. So the important thing with this too is that this is in the counter step. So for example, let's say your opponent's attacking with something that's a 5k. You can use your once per turn to use the effect to give up to one of your opponent's leaders or characters minus 4. So it becomes a 4k, and then you can use Red Hawk to get rid of it too. So it doesn't have to be the thing attacking either. Shanks just gives anything minus 1,000, not necessarily the card that is attacking, which is pretty flexible with it. And it's also for the turn, but that is a pretty good synergy for it. Most people are playing around this, and you can even do this without anything special by just putting Dawn on your cards before you attack. So if you have like 2 5ks out, just put 1 Dawn on each of them, and then you're able to get that attack as well. I also want to mention that you kind of want to, before your opponent uses the effect for Shanks, you want to start kind of attacking as 6ks, right? Make it so they're always losing a card when trying to defend you, and then once they have defended or use the Shanks leader effect, you want to be able to then push some real advantage for it. So if you're attacking a 7k into this Shanks without them using their effect, they can just easily use their effect and then 2k, and so the first 7k usually has to happen after they use their leader effect. So I recommend trying to make it a little bit tricky for them to be able to get any value off that in the first place. So after that, we are looking at just some kind of cards the deck runs in general. There's some consistency cards and just like some 2Ks that just help the deck in general. So Uta is our only real searcher in the deck, and it's not even a red hair pirates, which is kind of weird, but like it does help you find some of your pieces for it. Not everyone runs this card. The fact that there is a lot of top end for this deck that this doesn't find. I've kind of played without it and with it, and you'll see my deck list at the end too, but I think you kind of need to run a couple copies of this just to be able to have something to play early game. The fact that this does find your 10 drop, which in most situations you want to play that on curve every game, I think it's just kind of worth it in my mind. So I'm playing copies of it, but if you don't like the card, you don't have to run it. And then we have 2 different 2Ks. One, the lime juice I thought was going to come up a little bit more often, and it might still be relevant. The fact that you can, on play up to one of your opponent's characters with 4k power or less can't activate blocker for the rest of this turn. So there are some scenarios where if they have like a Rebecca, you just play the lime juice and then you can go from there. But the Hongo's actually been one of the better cards for this deck. It is a 2k, but also activate main. You can rest this character if your leader has the red-haired pirates type. Give it to one of your opponent's characters minus 2k power during this turn. So this does show up pretty often, and there are some matchups, for example, like Doflamingo, where they're not actually going to be able to remove this cleanly, or if they do remove it, they bounce it back into your hand. And so because of that, this does help you set up for some removal late game. You can just kind of play it on curve against everything that's like not Rob Lucci, and because of that, you just get some advantage in my mind. So the fact that this also can like attack later in the game too, it's just like a weird card that you play on curve most of the time, and then if you do, you get rewarded for it later if your opponent doesn't, force some removal into it, which I don't really feel like we've seen as much card removal in this set and in this meta compared to where we were at in like OP08 at times, at least for kind of some of the smaller bodies. And since Rob Lucci is less popular than it's been in the past, so definitely make sure to look at that. And if there's some times that it makes sense to play this early, I definitely recommend it. So we also have some more like defensive card, kind of mid-range cards for the deck. We have Lucky Roo, which this one looks solid when you play. And if this came out in set one, like people would be like complaining about this card all the time. I think this is just an okay card at the end of the day, but it is a blocker that does kind of force some trades between some decks. You don't really play it out if you're playing against Doflamingo because they can just bounce it back into your hand. But on KO, if your leader has the red hair pirates type, KO up to one of your opponent's characters with original power of 6k or less. So the fact that its original power is both good and bad, it means that like if they're attacking as a 7k, we can't like use our leader effect, like a base power of 7k. We can't use our leader effect in this to get rid of it. Has to have a base of 6 or less. But that also means if they put like 7 Dawn on like a 2k or something, we can block and KO it. So there's like weird like synergies with it, but it's generally a solid card. I've kind of looked at if we want to play it or not, and I think it's generally fine. Yasop, I feel like this card is like a little bit better in other leaders, but it is still solid in its own way. On play, one of your leaders gets plus 1k power until the end of your turn, which is really good. And then this other effect is like a little bit, I think, underrated, but Dawn times 1 when attacking. Up to one of your opponent's characters get minus 1k power for this turn. So being able to use this to additionally like get some removal power, put things in range, or make this even like a 7k attack that attacks into a 5k that turns into a 4k. That kind of stuff I think is great for Yasop as well. So because of this, I think this is an okay card. I don't think it needs to be running Shanks all the time to make it an actual 6k leader, but I do think it's okay. And then also we have silvers. This is a Rogers pirate, so this is not a red hair pirates, but it's something that came out of the set that I think is pretty strong. It's kind of like a queen, but with a little bit less consistency. So if your opponent has 2 or more characters with an original power 5k or more, draw 2 cards and discard 1 card from your hand. So if you're playing against Doflamingo, this almost always draws you and discards 1. If you're playing against some other decks, they don't necessarily play 2 bodies out. So I think this is like good to play a couple copies of. It's one of our only real draw cards in this deck, and it just is unfortunate that it's based on being your opponent having that 2 5k or more characters out, which you really don't have ways to control that, right? They either have it or they don't. But I think that's something to worth mention for one of our defensive cards too. So, and then there's also kind of this idea of playing some cards that are just kind of harder to remove. Every time I play with Ace in my builds, people are like, "Why are you playing that card? It's not a Whitebeard Pirates. You don't get Rush. Why would you play it?" The secretly actually better card effect for this Ace is it's once per turn. So if this character would be removed from play by one of your opponent's effect, by whatever kind of effects, if it's returned to hand, bottom deck, KO'd, put into my life, whatever the case is, even if it's like to be put into your life, which is actually a relevant thing, which we'll talk about in a little bit, you just get minus 2k power for the turn. So this just being out on the board to be able to force some attacks later in the game is just solid enough that it's just a body that your opponent's going to have a hard time removing, which is pretty good. So, and then there's also Marco. This is an oldie but a goodie. Your turn once returned, K up to one of your opponent's characters with 3k power or less. So this does sometimes get some removal on play, but then also on KO, you may trash 1 event cards from your hand. Play this character from your trash rested. So just to be able to establish a 5-drop 6k body that, again, your opponent's going to have to jump through some hoops to get rid of, I think is solid enough by itself that it's worth running these in their own way. This is kind of a decision point for it, but I think you really do get rewarded for being able to play out this Ace and just have it stick on the board at the same time. So there we go. And then we also do have some high-end cards. So we've got Ben Beckman, which this card, if we didn't come out during the same set that Marshall D. Teach came out, it would be so strong. It would be immediately very, very good. And it's still very good, don't get me wrong. But the fact that, on plays are the weakest they've ever been, and then you get this really strong on play is not lost on me. But on play, trash up to one of your opponent's characters with power of 6k or less. And this is just trash. So this is not KO'd. If you play this against like a 5-cost Magellan, they don't get their own KO effect. It's 6k or less is pretty generous for removal as well. So you're able to get out some really big bodies, and then also you can pair this up with some additional effects. So obviously I play a lot of Marco. This would be insane in Marco, and you probably do if you play Marco and OP09. I just don't know about playing Marco and OP09, but this is just a really solid card that I think is great. It's also got a 1k. It's also searchable. It's a 7-drop 7k. There's just so many good things about this card that it's just a little bit insane. So it's worth running in my mind. You just have to worry about Marshall to teach that this doesn't get as much value. And then we've got our 10-cost Shanks, which I kind of like I started this meta, like this card's pretty good. And the more I've played, I'm like, man, this card is really, really good. All of your opponent's characters get minus 1k power, just a permanent while it's on the board. And then also just has rush. So it's great. It's hard to remove against a lot of decks because of the 10 drop. The other kind of way I've been kind of thinking about this is that this kind of gives you like a plus 1k permanent on your leader, if that makes sense, right? The fact that all of your opponent's characters get minus 1k power means that they have to, add additional power to even just try to pressure our leader, and then we can still use our leader effect to get out of an attack for free for the turn. So I think this is great. If you're able to play out 2, you're just doing well. I've also been playing a lot of red and purple Luffy, which we'll probably talk about in another video. But being able to ramp and be able to be rewarded with your ramp to be able to play this guy is additionally, I think, very strong. So because of all that, I think that Shanks is in a really good spot in this meta because this 10 drop, if we're able to get to the late game with a kind of healthier life total, a lot of decks can't easily remove this. There are ways, but it's not very cost efficient. And you already have a 10 drop 12k attack that went in that you usually like at least traded with something. Like you can put a lot of pressure on like a Gecko Moria if they don't have a blocker out. Or something like that. It's just a very, very good card. And then lastly, it's the Goldie Roger, which I think this card is like really well designed as a secret rare in the sense that it's really cool. It's really flashy. You'd probably play like 1 or 2 copies of it, but it's not like an end all be all. It's not broken in any way, but it is kind of strong for some end game positions. It sometimes lets you win games that you weren't supposed to in a lot of ways. And the fact that it kind of prevents your opponent from really wanting to put you down to 1 or from 1 to 0 because they have to be aware that Roger can come down next turn and just win you the game. So if you guys don't know, rush, and then also when your opponent activates blocker, if you or your opponent has 0 life, you win the game. So the fact that sometimes there's just some weird scenarios where one, if they have 0 life and they're trying to block her up, you can play Goldie Roger and they can't activate any of their blockers, which feels really good. But also conversely, if you've got kind of a wide board, but they're going for game, they're trying to pressure you to win on the next turn, you can use Goldie Roger, and then if they set you down to 0, to be able to just make all of your attacks not be blocked as well. So I don't think blockers are as good right now. They still are present, but they're not as present as they used to be. So Goldie Roger, I think, is still fine. You probably play like 1 swag copy of it, but it's not something that you play more than 2 copies in my mind. So these are kind of all the kind of cards I want to talk about. And real quick, I do want to kind of talk about some weaknesses for this deck and just kind of some counterplay in general. I kind of mentioned it already, but you really want to just kind of force them to discard a card every time. So even if that means like you attack 6Ks into them, that just means that they're kind of either forced to 2K out, or they have to use like their leader effect and still use a 1K. So 6Ks are really, really good against Shanks because you don't have a lot of 2Ks in the deck generally compared to other decks, and it just kind of forces like a discard and a 1K sometimes. So I think that's something that's relevant. And then also we do have the matchup spread. This is from our power rankings, which you can find on my website as well. But you'll look in that, I think Shanks has a pretty good matchup spread across everything, right? And I think that's kind of like the plus and the minus for this deck, and kind of has what some of my issues of like what the consistency with it is, that all of these matchups are about 50-50, right? Like we do have some like better ones towards the end where where it's like 60% in our favor against black and purple Luffy, the Bonnie, as well as the a pudding, which was, I guess, doing well for this week. But in my mind, it just kind of means that like, yeah, we're really got some pretty solid matchups into the top end, but they're all like 50-50, right? Teach and Rob Lucci were like a little bit preferred for it, but we're not really doing fantastic against anything either, right? We're just good. We're a deck that can win a lot of the time, but I also think that part of the issue for that are two things. One, consistency. We don't really have a lot of consistency pieces in this deck. It's either we find and draw our pieces or we don't. We don't really have a way to make that more consistent with our current card pool in red. And then also, I think some people are just adjusting to how to play against this deck inherently, right? Once people kind of figure out what Shanks does and how to play against it and how to get the most value out of your attacks and stuff, I think that these win rates might be a little bit lesser as well. So that's something in my mind. But generally speaking, and ironically, if you're playing a Luffy leader, chances you have a moderately good to good matchup against it. We've got both of our purple Luffys as well as our black and yellow Luffy. All these having some pretty good win rates against Shanks right now. We also have like Nami and Zoro and Katakuri towards the end of the list on the right there. But those are just kind of, generally speaking, like just good aggressive decks, which Shanks still has to respect those, even if we're sometimes a 6K leader as well. But again, I think like the best way to do this is that like Shanks doesn't have like really any high end removal. So if you're able to use like a purple deck to ramp into your high pieces earlier, you get a lot of value before they're able to play out their Shanks and get that pressure too. So this is kind of just my thoughts. It's just kind of like I think honestly the best way to play against this is just play as Shanks and play to learn how to play against it, because you'll find yourself in these scenarios where you're like, oh, if they like hit me with like two 7K attacks, I probably just lose the game, right? And just kind of recognize like the weaknesses for some builds and also how bricky you can be depending on that too, I think helps you learn how to you're the best way to play against the deck as well. But that's kind of my thoughts on it in general, and let's go to our example build. All right, here's my current build of Shanks. And if you guys want to see any of my current builds in this card game right now, I do have a page on Eggman Events. You can find linked in the description. It does have a couple builds of Shanks. I had one that was more a little bit Red Hawk based, but this is just kind of my current OP09 list as it is. But generally, it's just kind of like a hybrid of a good amount of cards between everything. I've kind of cut back a little bit on some of the top end, just because I found like so many times I just had too many of the cards in my hand that just didn't have any counter, which even if we get out of one attack for free per turn sometimes, you still kind of need a little bit of that as well. So currently what that looks like though is that we do have like our consistency pieces. I am playing Uta because I just really want to find 10 cost Shanks every game, right? There are just so many times where I don't see it. I do know that it like bottom decks are silvers, it bottom decks are Monkey D Dragon and our Goldie Roger, but I'd rather still have a card that I can help find like my actual boss monster for what this is. Sometimes it cannot find us a blocker, sometimes it can like upgrade us to a 2K, but I think all of that is very good. So we do have that. I am playing the Ace and Marco. I might just put 4 copies of Ace and this kind of maybe remove the Marco, but I'm doing 3 and 3 right now. I do think that's strong. Our top end is 7 copies of Ben Beckman. We have our silvers, which this card is also just very good in a lot of ways, being able to get like double removal. It also means that sometimes your opponent's going to have a harder time attacking into us on the next turn. I do think that's great for us. Dragon is super aggressive as well, being able to be a 9K card with Rush. That also gives our leader like +2 Dawn, which is really good. And then we also have our 10 cost Shanks. We also have the 10 cost Shanks from OP06, just on play KO to one of your opponent's characters with 10K power less. This just gets rid of most cards in the game. So this is just good. There's some times where you need like this against the deck that's playing like a green Zoro, because we don't really have a lot of removal for that. Otherwise, I think that's something that's just impactful for this game too. So I do like the addition of that. And then we do have the Red Hawk. I haven't really mentioned it, but the trigger for this card really breaks a lot of effects too. Like if your opponent's going for like it's kind of like a beige, right? Being able to give something minus 10K power just means that they legitimately cannot attack, right? Unless they put like all 10 Dawn back onto a card, it's unlikely that they're actually going to be able to finish the game, which I think is interesting. So that's something that's kind of worth it. So we're playing 3 copies of that. 2 Rad Beams, self-explanatory, one of our best red defensive cards, and then also 2 copies of Bad Manners Kick Course, since we are playing a good amount of non-counters as well. Currently we're playing 18, which is one of the lower numbers for it. But I don't know, like it's such a balance when it comes to deck building this deck specifically, because of the fact that we can be like a little bit greedy because we do have our leader effect, and then if we get to a late game where we're just playing a big body every turn, most decks just can't keep up with it, because again, this card getting like immediate value and pressure is very good. This 10 cost Shanks too, like the dragon, the Beckman, the silver. All of these cards are great that are able to kind of interact with our opponent, but then also just make it difficult for them to remove on the crackback too. So I think this is kind of where my current build is. This is not the only way to build it, and I have been just experimenting a lot with it. I think this is something that you're going to have to just decide on deck building choice, where how much consistency you want versus how much of a ceiling of power that you want. And it's going to be tricky for me to find the happy medium. So this is the build. This is the video going over Shanks. I hope you guys enjoy it as well. Let me know if there's any other leaders from this that you guys want a video like this for, and I'll catch you all next time.